Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the 2021 ABLE virtual series. And thanks for your patience as we were figuring out some of the technology in the background. You may have heard us, so thank you. So my name is Elodie Young, Director of Impact and Innovation at Prosper Canada, and I will be your MC today. I'm joining you today from Toronto, which is situated upon traditional territories. The territories include the Wendat, Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited to this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. The ABLE virtual series is hosted by Prosper Canada on behalf of the ABLE Steering Committee. Prosper Canada is a national charity dedicated to expanding economic opportunity for Canadians living in poverty through program and policy innovation. ABLE is a cross-sector community practice working to reduce poverty through financial empowerment. Now I want to take a minute and recognize our sponsors. So I'm going to show all their beautiful logos to you. There we go. And so we're grateful to our generous event sponsors, TD Bank Group and Intuit Financial Freedom Foundation, our silver sponsor, the Cooperators, and all of our bronze sponsors listed on this slide. This series would not be possible without you, so thank you so much. If you're joining us for the first time today, here are a few things to note before we dive into our first session. If you haven't already completed your profile on our event platform, we encourage you to do so. This will ensure you're able to participate in our networking session at 1:15 p.m. following our first session. The menu on the left shows you how to navigate our event platform. This is where you will find today's sessions. You made it this far, so far so good. The right-hand side of your screen has some helpful features. Feel free to type in your questions or messages at any point using the chat feature. My colleague, Wendy, will be monitoring the chat. Throughout all of the sessions, we will also encourage you to ask questions to our speakers. Please use the Q&A tab to type in your questions. All right, I'm moving back here. I'm going to stop sharing, and then now I'm going to ask you to go over to the polls. So on the right-hand side as well, you'll see I've just added a poll for you all to look at. The question is, did you participate in the first day of this series, which was on November 10th? And you can say yes or no. I'm going to say yes because I was here and I see the votes are coming in. So thank you so much. And it looks like actually quite a few of you were here on November 10th. So it's great to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us. I also encourage you to say hello using the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. So you can go ahead and do that now as well. Please note that today's sessions will be recorded and posted on the ABLE Financial Empowerment website. Our day 1 session, Tackling Pandemic Hardship, is there already for anybody who missed it. Now, without further delay, it's my pleasure to kick off our first session this afternoon. Measuring the Divide, has COVID-19 widened economic disparities for Canada's BIPOC communities? It is generously sponsored by the Intuit Financial Freedom Foundation, who also happens to be one of our event sponsors. The Intuit Financial Freedom Foundation is proud to lend its support to the ABLE virtual learning series and the efforts of partners across Canada to advance solutions that will enable financially struggling individuals to rebuild their financial health and independence. It is no coincidence that one of the largest movements for social change happened during the most devastating pandemic in recent history. Some driving forces, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, The discoveries of Indigenous children graves and the pandemic together brought renewed awareness of the inequalities that Black, Indigenous, and people of color face daily. This is why we chose to spend today focused on BIPOC communities and their financial health. I'm looking forward to the rich discussions we're going to have on this topic today. After this session right now, you'll get to pick between two sessions, one focused on Indigenous financial wellness and the other on how financial empowerment should be supporting anti-racism work. They will both be a great way to dig deeper into this important topic. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Aman, but in the meantime, I would like to invite you all to reflect on this question. And so if you can go back to the poll, now you've gotten to practice. So I'm going to hide this one and show you the new one I want you to look at right now. And so the next question I have for you is, based on your work over the past year and a half, who would you say has been most affected in terms of their financial health by the COVID-19 pandemic? So we've got a few different groups, and there's a group at the end, which kind of you can choose if you believe that it's people who are in more than one of the groups above. So you can go ahead and answer. And I'm seeing the votes coming through. So thank you. While I let you keep on voting, I would like now to introduce our moderator, Aman Malis, Executive Director of the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities. Aman is he is a former marine ecologist, and as he tells me often, he brings an ecosystem lens to everything he does. He also brings extensive experience in settlement and immigration, community health, social services, and community development, and funding and sector capacity. He has held leadership roles at United Way Toronto, Okasi, Lawrence Heights Community Health Center, and Family Services Toronto. From an anti-racism lens, he has held leadership roles such as including Inclusive City Canada's Toronto Civic Panel, the African Canadian Social Development Council, and the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. So please join me in welcoming Aman. Thank you so much for being here today, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Elodie. I am hoping that everybody can hear me. I am excited to be part of this session today. I'm going to start by acknowledging the land. Today, I am joining you actually from Seattle. I'm not in Toronto. Where Seattle is the unceded traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the First Peoples of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who continue to steward these lands and waters since time immemorial. I honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. As a newcomer to Canada myself and a Torontonian, I'm grateful to have made Toronto my home, where I raised my family. Toronto, as you know, is covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and the Chippewas bands. I would like also to honor my African ancestors that have been stolen from the land and forcibly transplanted in Turtle Island as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Today, I recognize and renew my commitment to a just Canadian society that can only exist if you and I play our roles as enshrined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. It's very important that we do the land acknowledgement by renewing our commitment, and I'm hoping that you'll join me in doing that. Again, welcome to the session, Measuring the Divide. Has COVID-19 widened economic disparities for Canada's Black, Indigenous, people of color communities? I'm sure many of you attending today's session already know that the pandemic has disproportionately impacted these communities. What we may not know at all, perhaps, is how much and in what ways more specifically. Addressing disparities starts with a hard look at who is affected and how. This might be one of the only positive aspects of this pandemic, the fact that the new research and the new data that has emerged is helping us to start to understand which communities, which ethnic groups, which racialized groups are actually mostly affected and how. Two leading researchers with stellar backgrounds, Andrew Heiss and Dr. Juan MacKenzie, today are going to share with you what they have learned over the past 18 months about the disparities in financial health experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in Canada, and how they have been affected by the pandemic itself. But before we go into our presenters, I would like to share a video about Riley Nepanak. It's important to ground our discussion here indirectly from the people who have experienced disparity and exclusion. Before we start, I would like to share with you the video, which will be running now in a moment. You will see that from Riley's story, that he credited Seed Canada in Winnipeg for their financial empowerment programming for helping him, to craft a new amazing story that you'll be able to see in a moment. So let's roll the video.
Hello, my name is Riley Nepanak. Anin Buju Dijnikaz Riley Nepanak. I am from Saugeen First Nation, and I grew up living in Winnipeg's North End. Being a proud North Ender and a St. John's High School alumni, I developed a strong passion for two things: playing football and working with youth, both of which gave me an outlet to develop myself as a leader and gain a huge sense of pride for my community. These past 5 years have been a blessing for me. I've had the opportunity to become a carpenter and work on projects like converting the old Merchants Hotel into student housing. I've been able to travel the world and work as a flight attendant with Air Canada. And my favorite accomplishment being that I was able to co-found a grassroots, youth-focused community organization, but we'll get to that later. This all stemmed from a little seed. I found out about Seed Winnipeg when I was in college taking carpentry. My teacher brought in Millie Acuna from Seed, who gave me my first lesson on financial literacy, something I didn't learn about before. I worked a part-time job at a community center while going to school, and a huge problem for me was budgeting, so I took their money management training program. In this program, it made me more mindful of the differences between needs and wants, and helped me a lot when it came to saving. I was finally able to save up enough for a car, which was very handy in terms of helping my family and opening the door for employment opportunities. I also participated in their famous Savings Circle program, which runs in partnership with Assiniboine Credit Union and United Way Winnipeg. Once you save up $250, that amount is matched 3-to-1, with the next step being purchasing an asset. So with the $1,000 total, I chose to spend it on a much needed laptop, a laptop that I still use to this day. I've used it to create resumes, apply for jobs, and even education. Over the years, I stayed in touch with Millie, as I considered her a great mentor. The bonus is that she even helps me with filing my taxes every year. Millie recommended I participate in the Train the Trainer program because she knew I liked connecting with people, and I could use the practice of speaking to a crowd and sharing my story, almost as if she knew I'd be sitting in this spot one day. The great thing about Seed is that they have employees like Millie who all work together to provide an amazing service to the North End and its economic development. Plus, they teach you big words like economic development. In 2020, the pandemic hit all of us hard, but especially those most vulnerable. My sister and I noticed this. We noticed the increase in pollution. We noticed the impact it had on people living in the streets. And in the summer of 2020, we decided to do something about it. And so we started Initiative. Initiative is an Indigenous youth leadership program that connects youth to their community through volunteerism. In weekly green walks, we distribute food, warm clothes, we pick up garbage and recycling, and needles in Winnipeg's North End. We're located at Ralph Brown Community Center. Each week we had a full team of dedicated volunteers from all ages and backgrounds working together to accomplish this. We picked up 10 bags full of garbage and recycling each week. That's 40 bags of waste a month. We also fed up to 50 people per walk. And because we walk twice a week, that can add up to 400 mouths fed every month. These youth that participated are getting a chance to see the impact they are making in person, and in return, it is helping them develop empathy for others and develop the same leadership skills I received when I was young. Code Red has since put our walks on pause, and in the wintertime, when we couldn't pick up the waste, we decided to provide a snow shovel support program to provide a safer environment to elders, single parents, and people with disabilities that aren't able to shovel their own walkways. With the help of WASAC, we also provided 25 families with hampers every 2 weeks. This is the power of volunteerism, youth engagement, and community collaboration. This is the result of us taking initiative. We call it initiative because Anishinaabe means our people, and initiative means to take action. So this word initiative means to take action to care for our people and to care for the land, which is what Winnipeg needs more of in 2021.
An amazing story of this young leader, Riley. So we're going to now proceed to introducing our first speaker, Andrew Heiss, who is the director of the Center for Income and Socioeconomic Wellbeing at Statistics Canada, and he's responsible for census, survey, and administrative data programs on income, pensions, housing, and wealth, as well as programs on household expenditures and well-being. Andrew is a member of the Human Capital Policy Council of the C.D. Howe Institute. He's also a member of the UN Economic Commission for Europe Task Force on Disaggregated Poverty Measurement, the Task Force on Social Exclusion, and Luxembourg Income Study Advisory Board. Andrew has collaborated on a number of research projects on the topics of wealth, income inequality, and low income. From 2018 to 2020, he led the second comprehensive review of the market basket measure, which is Canada's official poverty line. Andrew was also a member of the Research and Advisory Evaluation Commission for the Ontario Basic Income Pilot in Canada. In 2007, Andrew was the co-recipient of the Mike Kraken Award for Economic Statistics from Canadian Economics Association. While Andrew is speaking, please type your questions in the Q&A session. I will monitor the questions. You can also review other participants' questions and vote for the ones you'd like me to ask. The more votes a question gets, the more likely it is that I will ask the question during our panel discussion. Andrew, off to you.
Andrew, if you're here, can we ask you to share audio and video just so you can come on? I don't see you yet. There you are. Perfect.
Beautiful.
Sorry about that, Elodie. I didn't realize I was not with you for a minute there. I was enjoying the video like others, and I really appreciate the words of Aman. And I only wish that I would have shortened my bio a little bit, and I felt that was a bit long. Sorry for the barking of my dog. I also have a family here at home with me, so there could be a little bit of noise in the background, but we'll try to get through it anyways. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land I work from is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel discussion today. It's a great opportunity for me to share some of the key takeaways that my team's drawn from analysis of data on the socioeconomic well-being of Canadians and their families. Throughout this presentation, I have a few slides, like maybe a dozen. Throughout the presentation, I'll make reference where I can to visible minorities, and where possible, disaggregate the results to detailed groups. Statistics Canada still uses the term visible minority as used in the Employment Equity Act, as defined as persons other than Aboriginal peoples who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. We're aware that there are concerns that have been raised regarding the sensitivity and appropriateness of this term, but we continue to revisit ways in which to collect and disseminate data on this topic. We regularly meet with various stakeholders, data users and communities, and so input from you on anything, but including the terminology that we use is appreciated. I'll share my screen here now. Hopefully I can walk myself through this. So I'm looking for a window, and I'm looking for that, and a share. Okay, I trust everybody can see that. Through my presentation today, I'll be walking through a few questions.
Sorry, Andrew, I don't think we
what
can
were the
see-
pre-pandemic poverty conditions? What were the labor market impacts of the pandemic? Who received pandemic benefits, or pandemic relief benefits more precisely? What was the role of pandemic benefits in reducing low-income inequality? And what are some ongoing challenges? And finally, I'll sum up by talking a little bit about a new initiative at Statistics Canada, which is what is the Disaggregated Data Action Plan? I'll start with a couple of slides on the pre-pandemic situation. We have extremely rich data, going up to 2020, less, of course, from that point onward, as it takes time to collect and process data. But it was pretty clear that in the years leading up to the pandemic, Canada had been making progress on its poverty reduction goals. We see here on the graph on the right, the poverty rate is measured by the market basket measure, which is Canada's official poverty line. The blue line shows the poverty rate of 14.5% in 2015, falling to 10.1% by 2019. Data for 2020 should be available in February of 2022. Sorry about that. But I think what I want to really draw people to is that there are still substantial groups, differences among groups. For example, on the panel on the right, we see, by 2019, poverty rate among First Nations people of 22%, twice as much as what it is for all persons, 17% for recent immigrants. So there continues to be big differences among different groups in terms of their poverty rates. I want to draw your attention to one more thing on this slide on the right, which is that it doesn't specifically speak to visible minority groups. And sometimes as I go through the presentation here, I have to do this because of data limitations. It's just not available on all of the data. But we are correcting these things at Statistics Canada. The data source that you see here today, the Canadian Income Survey, is introducing questions that will allow us to disaggregate by visible minority group, and that will start in the 2020 reference year. A couple of other indicators from that are poverty related. The graphic on the left shows the percentage of persons living in core housing need. Core housing need is related to the idea that your housing is not affordable, or also doesn't have enough bedrooms for your family size, or also in some need of repairs, and you don't have enough money to afford an alternative dwelling in the community that you live in. And we'll see this rate for 2018 was about 9% for all persons, but it was as high as 35% for Inuit, 15% for Black Canadians, 20% for Arab Canadians. So again, a lot of diversity among groups, and lower outcomes or worse outcomes for groups designated as visible minorities or Indigenous people. The picture on the right shows food insecurity, which is another indicator of poverty. And we see the food insecurity rates much higher for Indigenous people and somewhat higher for recent immigrants. Again, data for visible minorities for this particular indicator will become available in 2020. So that brings us to the outbreak of the pandemic. So from my perspective, because I'm going to be talking about economic well-being outcomes such as low income or poverty, a place to start for that is to think about what happened to employment at the beginning of the pandemic. So this is a well-known statistic. Almost 3 million jobs were quote unquote lost at the beginning of the pandemic due to the government-induced shutdowns that were required for health reasons. That was a decline of 15% in the number of people employed, and as I said, 3 million jobs. Lots of research has come out since then showing that specific groups that were at greater risk of loss, for example, women, recent immigrants, workers with lower earnings and education, and workers who work in industries that I'll just say required personal contact. So, these are your variety of services industries, accommodation and food services, arts and recreation, those sorts of things. Correspondingly, family earnings fell. So when employment falls, family earnings fall. What I'm showing you here is some estimates that we created at Statistics Canada showing weekly family earnings for representative weeks throughout the months of the pandemic. And it's kind of an equivalent unit per person measure. So so what it means is that it's like if you start at the black line in January, it means about $850 per person in the family, but there is some adjustments made to favor family size, just so that we can make these results more comparable, just in case some of the groups are typically have different family sizes or are more likely to be single or whatever. So that makes these data nicely comparable. And we see that with the onset of the recession. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse here. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But a decline of 22% in family earnings at the median with the onset of the pandemic-induced slowdown. We also see some indicators here for different visible minority groups on the left. I selected a few. We have a few more. One thing to notice is there's quite a bit of jumping up and down, and that's normal for this kind of statistic because they're drawn from sample surveys, and so there's some variability in the survey. But it's clear that generally speaking, it's not obvious that from the data that we have, because the data that we have started roughly in June, it's not obvious that the situation was worse in terms of the pandemic slowdown from this data for visible minority groups, but it is certain that the post-pandemic period showed the same gaps as like what we showed before in the pre-pandemic period regarding poverty indicators. That in this case, visible minority families were doing worse off. And on the panel on the right, where it shows Indigenous persons, First Nations were also doing worse off in terms of most of the pandemic period. Of course, we know that earnings wasn't the whole story of pandemic and income. We know that rapidly the government introduced extensive pandemic assistance benefits. These were intended to soften the economic burden of the crisis confronted Canadian families. And we know that the intention wasn't necessarily to improve inequality or reduce poverty. It was really about stabilizing people's income. So people who lost hours or lost work received compensation for that. So what we see here is we see that the first big program was the SERB, as everybody knows. That wrapped up in October of 2020. Something on the order of 8 million applicants received SERB over this period. Almost 9 million applicants actually received SERB over this period. And after the closing of that, many SERB recipients would have shifted either to employment insurance or to the so-called CRB, the Canada Recovery Benefit. EI was retooled to allow people with fewer hours and easier access, so that many SERB recipients could go to EI. And the CRB was more for people that wouldn't be able to access SERB, especially as self-employed, stuff like that. Interestingly, the Canada Recovery Benefit closed in October, just very recently. And at that time, there were still about 800,000 recipients continuing to receive that CRB program. So I'll come back to that in a moment and talk about it a little bit more. One question that we're going to be keeping an eye on is, what happened to that almost million recipients after that program closed. One of the programs that's replaced it is a lockdown-oriented benefit, where if there's a government lockdown, then you can receive benefits, but it's not clear that people are being supported in the same way here. This slide talks about people that received SERB. So what we do here is we look at people who are eligible for SERB, and then we talk about what groups of people received it. I think the main takeaway from this is that SERB receipts really do line up fairly closely with groups that were impacted most in the labor market. So like workers initially employed in industries that were severely affected by economic lockdowns, like what I said before about the accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment, and recreation industries, large proportions of those workers received SERB. Likewise, large proportions of workers at the bottom of the income distribution or the earnings distribution received SERB. So the SERB receipts do largely line up with the groups impacted most in the labor market. Likewise, it's clear also that workers from visible minority groups receive SERB more often, and likewise, those members of visible minority groups with the lowest earnings tended to receive it more. So you can see that on the right side group. So West Asian, for example, 50% of West Asian workers receive SERB benefits. Korean, Arab, Black workers on the order of 43% received SERB benefits. And there's quite a tight relationship between how affluent, I suppose you could say, in the earnings category a group is on average, and its take up in the SERB benefit. Of course, there's a lot of reasons for this. Workers who, like as I showed a little earlier, workers from visible minority families tended to have lower earnings, and the lower earnings industries tended to be affected more of the pandemic. 2/3 of all workers in meat processing plants belong to a group designated as a visible minority. And that group, that industry experienced repeated COVID-19 outbreaks and shutdowns. In addition, visible minority workers are overrepresented in accommodation and food services, and that's one of the hardest hit sectors from the pandemic. So again, the SERB receipt lines up with what groups received it in terms of where you would expect to see it. And finally, we can map this stuff out. And I know there are many viewers from Toronto. We could prepare other maps for other areas, and you can see how the urban geography, if you will, and the socioeconomic picture of an urban space is reflected in SERB benefit take-up. So potentially not surprisingly, you see relatively low take-up of SERB in the affluent downtown core, represented by the green spaces in the center, but more SERB take-up in the west of Toronto and in the east of Toronto, and more in the suburbs.
Okay.
So this all provided a high level profile of those Canadians who received pandemic benefits. Now I'll turn a little bit to talk to you about how the relief programs actually helped Canadian families cushion the blow from the labor market shock induced by the pandemic. What I have on this graph is if you remember the weekly earnings pictures I showed you a minute ago, this is sort of a version of those where we talk about weekly low earnings. So what share of persons in these groups or in these months have an earnings level that would put them in sort of low earnings relative to others in that period? That's the top line. So remember I said that earnings fell? Well, correspondingly, low earnings rose. So it's an important peak of an additional 10% of persons and families would have been had the potential to be pushed into low income because they lost their earnings. But you can see the picture at the bottom. What we've done is we've added in all of the pandemic benefits, and we've also added in the Canada Child Benefit and GST credits, sort of the regular benefits that people get from the government. And what we see then is there's no corresponding peak this surge in low income was essentially negated. In fact, if anything, the incidence of low income after you consider government transfers was slightly lower than the pre-pandemic period, as shown by the higher level in January 2020 and February 2020, and very slightly lower levels in say January 2021, February 2021. So all this to say that the government programs really did do appear to have mitigated the potential low-income impacts of the pandemic shutdown. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we can look at this as well for visible minority groups and First Nations as well, or Indigenous people in general. And a couple of things come from this graphic. First of all, the pandemic benefits. What this graphic shows, maybe I'll talk you through what the graphic shows. So if we look at, say, the bars for Black Canadians, what that says is that a Black Canadian family per person had a weekly earnings of about $600. And there's some equivalization for family size going on there, but roughly $600 per person. And then they received about $250 in government benefits, bumping up their median income to something closer to $1,000 per month. The amounts of benefits by those gray bars do tend to be higher for the Black, Chinese, South Asian, the visible minority groups, and also for First Nations, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner. So those groups, they had, as I described before, larger impacts in their employment and received more benefits. In fact, if you look at it really, really carefully, because it was the low earning groups that received more benefits, there's actually a little bit of an impact on inequality here in terms of income inequality. These benefits had the function of, at least for a little while, reducing some levels of inequality, some types of inequality. That's fairly common for government transfers because, as you know, government transfers tend to be means tested, and so they tend to reduce poverty and inequality.
And Andrew, as we continue with this discussion, I think in the panel segment of this event, we'll be able to come back to some of these. Maybe as you wrap up, there's a question that I wanted to pose that's coming through the Q&A. How has the pandemic changed Stat Canada's thinking and priorities about what it monitors when it comes to income security and Canadians' financial health? And maybe address that, and then we will move to Kwam and come back in the panel to address other questions that are out there.
Sure. So maybe I'll just put up on my screen the final slide of my presentation. One of the things that Statistics Canada is doing is we're engaging in what we call a disaggregated data action plan. This is a major investment in statistics at Statistics Canada, wherein a number of things are going to be done in terms of increasing sample sizes for surveys, adding more capacity for modeling and administrative data usage, as well as encouraging other departments and provinces to share administrative data with Statistics Canada, and also to collect on their administrative data indicators that will allow more disaggregation to be possible. This is a 5-year program, and I think we can already see it making some small differences, but certainly in the coming years, we'll see more evidence and information to tell us about what's going on in a variety of ways among disaggregated groups. I think people will have the drift of where I was going. Basically, if I was to answer the question in a clear way that's posed by this session, has COVID-19 widened economic disparities for Canada's BIPOC communities? I would say it's certainly shone a light upon the differences. It's certainly the differences existed before, and they still exist now. As an organization, so to tie back into this disaggregated data action plan, it's certainly given us as statisticians a strong nudge towards improving the information that we have on different communities. Okay. I think I'll pause there, and maybe if I have other points to make, I'll do it during the discussion.
Beautiful. Thanks, Andrew. And in fact, the questions are coming with comments. That's great. So we'll reflect them back in the panel segment. I'm going to now introduce Dr. Juan MacKenzie, our next speaker. Dr. Juan MacKenzie, as an international expert on social causes of mental illness and suicide and the development of effective, equitable health systems, is currently the Director of Health Equity at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health at CAMH, a full professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto, and a consultant working with the World Health Organization on equity. He has authored over 250 papers, 5 books, and received numerous awards. Juan has worked across a broad spectrum to improve population health and health services for 3 decades. He's a member of the National Advisory Council on Poverty, a member of Canada's Expert Advisory Panel of COVID-19 and Mental Health, and the Ministers of Health's COVID-19 Testing and Tracing Advisory Committee there. He, apart from being a policy advisor, an academic, and a researcher, he's also a columnist for The Guardian, The Times Online, and the Toronto Star, and he was a past BBC radio presenter. Dr. Juan, off to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and share my screen, and I'm going to try and go a little bit quickly to make sure we have time to talk. And so thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this event, and thanks Able and Prosper Canada. And it really is fabulous to follow you, Emmanuel. Lovely to see you. Haven't seen you for a long time. Riley, fabulous work. And of course, Andrew, really wonderfully detailed to see what's going on and what Stats Can are doing, and really great to see the work that's being done on disaggregated data. Now, I'm actually joining you from Geneva today, and so I'm not on Indigenous territory, but I must admit that I found Emmanuel's land acknowledgement and the acknowledgement of the Black diaspora to be excellent. Now, my presentation will add to Riley's and to Andrew's. It will add to Riley's because it will pick up on one idea that he quickly mentioned about the difference between needs and wants. And it will pick up on Andrew's because it is about the fact that COVID has magnified our social divide. But then it takes it a bit further than that, and it actually asks about what we were asked about right at the start, financial health is. So it asks us about what financial health is, that's what I'm going to talk about, and what needs and wants are given the experience of the pandemic. Now I'm going to focus a little on the Black population of Canada to make my point. Now, I recognise that many populations have been hard hit by COVID, but looking at one population and discussing that population can sometimes help us think through what is needed and what maybe we need to think about doing differently. I'm going to start with a little bit of a thought experiment. And it's based on this picture. Now, I love this image, and I love this image because it describes how some people were living in pre-pandemic cities like Toronto's and others in Canada. It was like living, especially if you're in downtown Toronto and you had money, it was like living on a luxury cruise ship. You had a fabulous life. Everything was available on board. You could eat in wonderful restaurants. You could exercise, you could go to movies, you could see great live shows, and you could live like royalty. And actually 30 to 40% of the population of Toronto were living like that. But the situation for the rest was very different. Some were in smaller boats. They had a modest standard of living. Now, they were generally safe, but they had more risks to their health. For instance, if there was a large wave or a storm, and of course they had more day-to-day stress. And then some were in a completely different situation. They were in the water. Now, they may have had their heads above water, but they were treading water and swimming just to keep them afloat. Their lives were high stress. Treading water takes a lot of energy, but you have got no alternative. If you stop treading water, you drown. But actually, if you continue to tread water, you use so much energy that you die younger. And even if you successfully tread water, you're at extreme risk from a wave. You're at extreme risk from storms. Now, these were and still are the day-to-day divisions we see in places like Toronto. And that's why we have graphs like this. What this graph shows is your life expectancy at age 25, dependent on your income. And this is taken from Statistics Canada data, with 1 at the bottom being the lowest income group and 5 being the top income group. And it shows that men in the top 20% of earners actually have 8 years longer life expectancy than the lowest 20% of earners. So these are men here, right at the top, the men, the blue line. If they're 5 at the age 25, they've got a life expectancy of another 60 years. But if they're in the bottom 20% of earners, they have a life expectancy of 52 extra years. The important thing, though, is not just the life expectancy. The important thing in the graph is to notice that for each different income level, your life expectancy changes. So when we think of the poverty level, or people who are in poverty, say for instance in level 1, they've got lower life expectancy than people who, say for instance, are on minimum wage, which would be level 2-ish, who they have less life expectancy than people who are on a living wage, and they have lower life expectancy than the middle class people, and they have lower life expectancy than people who are the top earners. And so we have this straight line. But usually when we think about financial health or income adequacy, we just draw a line anywhere on the graph. So if we're talking about, and because we do that, if we talk about people who have got the living wage, we decide that our target is going to be to get people to something that is a living wage. That means that there are still a lot of people who've got better health linked to their income, though there are some who have less. And the question that I'm asking, and one of the questions about today about what is this idea of financial health, or what should financial levels be for health, is where do we draw the line? if we're giving people things like the SERB, how much should it be? And how do we decide that? Do we decide that on the amount of money? Or do we decide that on what we're trying to achieve? Now, Wellesley questioned this and said, what would it look like to have a healthy life? How much income would we need? Would any of us need to have a healthy life? And we looked at the international literature and places who'd done this before. And then we did focus groups with the information we found around into various places in Canada. And we came up with some ideas about what you needed income for to keep you healthy. Housing. We know that we need to exercise. We know we need to look after ourselves. We know we need extra than the healthcare that we've got. We know we need transport. We know social connections are good for us and nutritious food. We know that we need to do some personal and professional development. And we know we need to save for old age. So these are the things that we have to do in order to look after our health. And it's possible to calculate how much money that you need in order to be able to do all of that. So after we got these 9 areas, we then said, well, how do we calculate this? And so we started off by looking at government documents and getting guidance on what is considered healthy or normal. And actually there's loads of government advice out on there. There's government advice on what a nutritious food basket looks like. There's government advice on how much exercise we should do. There's government advice on how much we should save. There's also government advice on what percentage of our income we should spend on housing. So all of these things are out there, and we put them together for the Greater Toronto area, and we started calculating. And what we found was that if you were single living in the Greater Toronto area, you needed between $46,000 and $55,000 dollars after tax in order to live a healthy life, and we called a healthy life thriving. And then we found that it was less if you're retired, between $33,000 and $35,000, and much more if you're a family of 2, between $105,000 and $130,000 for the family. That's the sort of order that we found. And then, having done that, we said, well, okay, well, who is earning that and who isn't? And we calculated that for different groups. And this is by racial groups in Toronto. And so we did it for the Black group, for the white group, and for other groups, so other visible minority groups using the Statistics Canada phrase. And we looked at it for the previous poverty range, which the lower income after a tax range. And you can think of this in these 3 groups here. The black is blue, the white is red, and other population is green. And you can think of the first one below the poverty line as being people who are in the water, treading water. You can think of people on the far right in the thriving as the people who are actually on that cruise ship having a great time. And you can think of people in the middle as being, in stable, but not stable living, sort of people who we were talking about on the ships, on the boats. And if we look at people in poverty, we can see that the black population, the highest rates of poverty at 35%, with other visible minorities at 27%, and the white population 21% living in poverty. But if you look at the other side, at people who are thriving, we found that only 26% of the black population are thriving. 47% of the white population in the Greater Toronto area are thriving. And 40% of other racialized groups are thriving. So the Black population is doing particularly badly with regards to being able to thrive. So we're not just talking about having your head above water. We're not talking about being in a small boat and then being worried about the coming storm. We're talking about people who are actually thriving. And when you start looking at it like that, the Black population doing particularly badly. So we saw huge divide by racial groups. We saw that the majority of people were not thriving and therefore not resilient to the coming storm. And then the storm came. And the storm came in the way of COVID. And rather than giving more statistics, I'll give some in just a second because I'm going to wrap up so that we can have a conversation. Think of a Black essential worker with a child living in a major city. We know if it's in the Greater Toronto area, you're not likely to be thriving. We know that if you're not likely to be thriving, you're less likely to be able to protect your health. We know that the biggest part of the thriving income is housing, so you're likely to be overcrowded. We actually know that essential workers and Black essential workers during the COVID were more likely to take public transport to work and were less likely to be able to follow public health advice. If you're overcrowded, you find it very difficult to physically distance and socially distance or isolate. If you're an essential worker, you're more likely to be exposed to COVID. And not surprisingly, you're more likely to get COVID. And because you have less wealth and less backup, the impacts of COVID are greater. It's not surprising that we get graphs like this. This is the rate of COVID, the rate ratio of COVID in Toronto, depending on how much money you have at your household income. And what it's showing is that compared to everybody else in Toronto, if your household income was less than $30,000 a year, you were 2.78 times more likely to be hospitalized because of COVID. If your household income was $150,000 or more, you're 5 times less likely to get COVID than everybody else. So this is a huge difference between these populations. One 3 times more likely, the other 5 times less likely, but not surprising when we're thinking about income adequacy. You don't need to be able to see all of these lines. What you need to be able to see is this is the impacts of COVID-19 in Ontario for different racial groups. And at the bottom of each one of these 4 graphs is the white population. And then we have various racialized populations, all of them, whether it's cases of COVID, hospitalizations, ICU admissions, or fatalities, every racialized groups has higher rates and therefore a higher risk than the white population, and sometimes up to 10 times a higher risk than the white population. But there weren't just impacts because of the disease, there are also financial impacts. And just to show you some of the other data that's out there, when you look at unemployment, this is StatsCan data between 2020 and 2021, the rise in unemployment for the Black population was 5.7%, and for the non-visible minority population, 3.7%. The unemployment rate in the 3 months up to January 2021 was 13% for the Black population and just about 8% for the non-visible minority population. And for the 15 to 25-year-olds, the Black population had a whopping 31% unemployment rate compared to 16% in the non-visible minorities. If you're looking at your financial needs, the Black population in 2021, 33% said they had difficulty making financial needs compared to 17% for the non-visible minority population. The average pay for the Black population was $26.70 an hour, compared to non-visible minority populations, which is $30.62 an hour. So before the pandemic, we had a minority of people who were living a thriving life. So we had a minority of people who were actually able to insulate themselves from the coming storm. And the pandemic showed that it put them at increased risk, with visible minorities and specifically the Black population at much greater risk of COVID impacts, not only from the disease, but from the financial impacts as well. And the question I wanted to ask today was, do we need to rethink what financial health is, or the level of finances you need for health in the light of COVID? Because when we've been thinking about living wages, which is less than the thriving wage, minimum wages, which is much less than the thriving wage, or when we think of poverty, none of these things are linked to what we need to have a healthy life. None of them are linked to what we need in order to protect ourselves and be resilient from the coming storm. None of those move more people into the life that is possible in Canada, rather than the life that most people have, which is not healthy. Remember, there is a straight line that links income to your life expectancy. And the question is, where do we draw on that line? What do we think a high-income G8 country should be thinking about for its population when we're thinking about finances and health? Should we be talking about pushing people over a poverty line, or should we be thinking about moving towards thriving? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Juan. The stats and the logic behind the stats is quite compelling, and I think some of the questions and comments that are coming speaks to that. So one of the questions perhaps that I could bring to your attention, you might want to address, is what do you think government systems and employers can do to take action in addressing the stats and concerns? Because you and Andrew actually are part of a number of bodies that are advising government on some of this. So what are your thoughts about really shifting the mindset to this thriving approach to look at the state of affairs?
I think for me, one of the things about thriving is everybody jumps to the same conclusion. So they say, oh, right, well, if we need everybody to get $44,000 and a single person to get $44,000 a year, then what we need is a $25 minimum wage. That's not what, there are loads of different ways to do it. That is one thing we need to do. But the reason for going through all of the things that we need in order to thrive is to identify all of the different possible opportunities. So if we made housing cheaper, you need less money. If we made old age pensions more generous, you need to save less. If we were more careful, if we, say, for instance, made universities free or cheaper, then you need to pay back less money in universities. The government's doing some great things on child benefit, and that $10 a day childcare, that will bring down the amount we need. So I think that there's going to be something around income. And I do think that in a high income country, we need to think about having high incomes, not just for some. Yeah, so that's what I think. But I also think we need to think about all of the other things we need to put together: free exercise, yeah, or supplemented exercise, or some sort of tax receipt for exercise. There are all of these different things you can do.
Yeah.
And doing it.
Yeah, maybe like at this stage, Elodie, if we can bring Andrew back and move into a panel discussion mode in the remaining time, because as I hear you, Kwam, I'm kind of reminded about the social determinants of health, because like basically, what's standing for me is like, when we talk about housing and transportation, like by bringing all these different determinants of health, there's almost like a multi-pronged approach to try to address the economic disparity.
Yeah, and I think for me, I also think of the social determinants of wealth. And the reason for that is poverty is expensive. It's really expensive for a country. And all of the programs you need keeping people in poverty is expensive. But actually, people generate wealth when they are part of society. So the more you can think of to make people's lives, to allow people to thrive, potentially, the more wealth we all have. So it's not that you're just giving things to people, you're allowing people to be part of society and contribute, right? So I think of the social determinants of health, and I like thinking them also as the social determinants of wealth.
Andrew, like, the what's emerging from the intervention of Dr. Kwam is this concept of the thriving threshold. And I don't know if at Stat Canada there is some thinking, and like there's this huge opportunity potential for the next 3 years, as you were talking earlier on about the disaggregated data. What are some things that could be thought at your end in terms of integrating this approach and thinking?
Well, certainly what we do right now is we create the market basket measure, which is the statistic that I showed you in my presentation, is based upon a basket of goods and services, and it's targeted towards a more modest standard of living, which would be somewhat below what Kwam was suggesting in terms of a thriving standard of living. But the same techniques and approaches can be used. That's essentially what Kwam described as what he did. He decided with his institute that this is the basket of things that people need to thrive in this community, and then he went out and measured them. I presume that's kind of the process. That's exactly what we did for the poverty line. So certainly something like that is entirely possible at Statistics Canada. You could even think about what would be the appropriateness of, say, taking the poverty line and doubling it. Just sort of, maybe it's a little less connected to the thriving concept, but it does provide you with an easy indicator of who might be more affluent in that sense. I had a thought while Kwam was talking about ways of thinking about the relationship between life expectancy and income. And Kwam, you correctly said, what you can do is you can make other things more affordable, or, as some people might say, you raise the minimum wage, raise people's incomes. It's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that either way, the correct policy challenge is to break the connection between income and life expectancy, so that it doesn't matter what your income is, your life expectancy ought to be the same. And there's a lot of different ways you could do that with approaches that don't have anything to do with income policy. They have a number of other approaches. And of course, you won't be able to do it if you only think about the average person, if you only think about sort of gross output of the economy. You'll never get there, because you have to be able to think about things in the distributional sense. Differences between the rich and the poor, the healthy and the unhealthy, the happy and the unhappy, and differences across groups, differences between geographies and different groups. And we are doing a lot more work in that area at Statistics Canada. Somewhere buried in the budget document, you'll see that there's a direction to work on what we call a quality of life framework, wherein we're trying to think about our social and economic statistics more holistically and how they all relate to one another, not just focusing on the big headline indicators like GDP growth or the CPI, which are, you know, extremely important and easy to communicate and very useful, but thinking about a more holistic group of indicators that can help us to guide policy and make decisions, allow policymakers to think about how does this policy that I'm creating improve the lives of people. So that's a direction that's related to a question that was in the chat as well. You know, where do you see things going? Well, I see things going in that direction in the short to medium term.
Yeah, and I like that, and because the point of the thriving income and the point of what I was saying wasn't actually necessarily about the income or the money. It was about the theory, as in, instead of saying sort of double the poverty level, double the poverty line, which is, you know, interesting or whatever, it's yes, but why? What are we measuring it against? And so I love the idea of quality of life, because you're measuring, you've got a target that is about trying to make things better for people. So we chose health because we thought it would be one of the least contested areas. And we thought being healthy everybody would agree with. Mm-hmm. But quality of life is, that's a contested area. I think it's a really great fact, great that it's going that way. Mm-hmm. The fact that there's such a huge literature on quality of life is going to be part of the wonderful challenge. Yeah. But yes, as Andrew said, this idea of, you know, have a theory, measure and quantify it, like the market basket measure, which, by the way, I think is fabulous. Mm-hmm. Is why we're starting to think of Thrive, and we're just trying to use a different philosophical background to the why do this, so mm-hmm. that we get to a different quantification.
Yeah, and maybe I could bring Taz Rajan's question and seek your feedback on how can we in the financial literacy world take this information and make a positive impact in our communities. Any thoughts about that?
Andrew? Clearly we have no thoughts, but so one of the things I really like.
I was waiting for Kwam.
I loved what Riley said about this idea of needs and wants. Mm-hmm. Because what I was trying to talk about was trying to work out the difference, yeah, and to try and be clear what needs are. And so the work that we were doing on Thriving was all about identifying health needs, which of course we would do because we're interested in health outcomes. But for me, certainly, definitely as I get older, health seems to be one of the focuses that sort of preoccupies me. And my needs tend to be more based on things that are healthy and would help me thrive than just, you know, the wants. And so if that could be helpful, I'm not sure whether that would be helpful for people when they're thinking about financial literacy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It may be that thinking about health will help.
Okay, and Sheila Reger is talking about, is there a huge opportunity to take this learning from SERB, etc., and the capacity of fast direct cash benefits to be deliberatively anti-racist, to bring in a permanent basic income guarantee? That's making a case or a plea for basic income guarantee. Any reactions to that?
Well, I for me myself, we were both part of the Ontario Basic Income pilot, and I believed I went into that pilot with total equipoise, meaning that I just wanted to see the outcome of the experiment. And I left it completely convinced that a basic income was a good way forward.
Okay. I know there are always more comments and questions in sessions such as this one. Maybe I could briefly ask each of you to comment on, you know, one thing that surprised you the most in your research during the pandemic. Anything that in the last 18 months was kind of aha moment or surprised each of you briefly? Andrew, maybe we can start from you.
Sure, I'm happy to. It'll just take me a second. When the pandemic started, Statistics Canada, we all started working from home. Things changed so rapidly. We heard, and we really tried to all pull together to put out good information in a really fast way that would help people to negotiate the pandemic. And in my part, we started doing this weekly income estimate. And I was really surprised at how much the government benefits seemed to offset, at least at the aggregate level. Like I think in the comments said, well, it didn't offset it for everybody necessarily, and that's true. Some people do fall through the cracks. I first looked at it with suspicion. I thought, what could be going wrong here? And you had Eloise at one of your sessions, I think earlier a week ago, from Seymour Consulting, and she started publishing the same thing, that several months after the beginning of the pandemic, in some ways people's financial resilience improved. They were saving more. They were trying to pay down debt. Maybe I'll just conclude by saying sometimes in bad times come good things. I don't know.
Yeah. And Juan?
So I would say that there are a number of different things that happened in the pandemic. I'm always amazed that we've been saying to everybody, give people money, get them out of poverty, give them a safety net, and they will be that, things will go better. And then when it happens, everybody says, hey, and you say, great, because, we've actually proved it. And one of the things that I thought was great, I thought the StatsCan has been actually, I think, really good during the pandemic, and the quality and quantity of information that's come out has been really good. I think the move towards socio-demographic data is a ha-ha moment for Canada, and that's superb. I think the rise in being able to say anti-Black racism and not have everybody sort of jump down your throat is something really different. And I also think the big thing for me, I have been in Canada and Europe, and also been looking at what's happening in the UK. The Canadian response is one of the best responses there has been to COVID worldwide. It is partly because of government. It is also partly because of the Canadian people. There is something special about what's happening in Canada. There's something special about what we did in the last financial crisis and what we're doing now.
Yes.
And the big aha moment for me is, can government at every level work out how to support and actually embellish that Canadian spirit that you see in Toronto, that you see in Montreal, that you see in Vancouver, you see in Kamloops, you see all over Canada? What can government do to push us up even further? Because there is something special going on.
I'm so glad you're mentioning that. And I think it's really, sometimes it's counting our blessings, recognizing our assets, and how do we work together to maintain the momentum and the gains and uplift further. Such a delight to be in conversation with you, Kwame and Andrew. I know Prosper Canada in organizing and bringing you here. They recognize the tremendous stellar background that you bring to this, and I look forward to hearing more about the work that you're doing, both at Stat Canada and at Wellesley. And on behalf of Prosper Canada, thanks for the time here. And so back to you, Elodie, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Aman, Kwam, and Andrew. I knew this would be a great session, and I think you all surpassed all my hopes. So thank you so much for being here. You know, the inspirational words, as well as the great data, you know, that we got from both you, Kwam and Andrew. It's really, really great to have you both. And Aman, thank you so much for doing such a great job of moderating